can go ahead and take our seats. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Wayne Nastri. I'm the Executive Officer for the South Coast Air Quality Management District. And before we begin, there's a few housekeeping items. We ask that you silence your phones and that if you need the restrooms are located to the rear and to the left. And in the event of an emergency, the exits are also to the rear. And if we need to shelter in place, you can grab onto your seat, go on the ground, and we'll let you know when it's clear. And that would cover the shelter in place. And so with that, let me welcome you all. As you know, we're here to discuss the facility-based source measures, otherwise known as the indirect source rules. Dr. Fine will be kicking off the meeting with Ian doing the presentation, and Kurt Weiss and I will be here to observe, answer questions where appropriate. So we know that this is a fairly intensive effort, and there are a lot of questions and concerns expressed by many on how we move forward. I do want to let you know that this is something that we hope will be a very collaborative, a very productive process, and we look forward to working with all of you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fine.
Thanks, Wayne. And I'm just going to say a few words about the meeting today and what we hope to accomplish. So first of all, many of you were intimately involved in the air quality management plan process over the past 2, 3, 4 years. And what we're doing today is kicking off the process that was anticipated in the adopted AQMP. The AQMP had descriptions of facility-based measures in many areas. It described the collaborative approach that we were going to take, at least initially. And there's a very detailed schedule about working group meetings and report back to our board on progress towards achieving reductions from these measures. So what we hope to do today is just kicking off that process. It's an introductory working group. We don't expect to get into the nitty-gritty details today. And what we're looking for is feedback on schedule and process and logistics of meetings coming forward. You're going to see we propose some breakout working groups for the different facility-based measures. And what we're really looking for today is feedback on that process going forward. If anyone has questions on the process and questions on where this is all headed, we'll hope to address those today. But the details of what these measures may end up looking like will probably be deferred to the working groups going forward. This is a working group, and typically our working groups are set up so it's an open dialogue, more of a roundtable discussion. You'll see it's hard to do that in a room such as this. One of the reasons we had it in this room is to accommodate what could have been large numbers. Also, the ease by which we can webcast this from this room compared to some of the other rooms. But going forward, the meetings will look more like our AQMP advisory group meetings. They will be more of a roundtable discussion as we dig in. Again, feedback on that process and how those working groups might take place is something we're looking for today. Just so you know, this is being webcast. There's the agenda that was sent out and is outside has the website for the webcast. There's also a call-in number that's also listed on the agenda for listening only. If anyone who's not here today wants to ask a question, they can be submitted to a special email that's been set up. We're flashing it up there for those on the webcast. For those on the phone, it's FBMSM, which is Facility-Based Mobile Source Measures, at aqmd.gov. And you can email us with questions anytime, and Dan is monitoring that, and we'll be able to answer those questions as we go. So realizing that this setup is not really the working group kind of dialogue, roundtable format that we would typically have for working groups and will have for working groups going forward, we still hope to get into that discussion and don't view this as a hearing and this is actually testimony. We're just trying to get some feedback on the process going forward. And again, we're committed to what we said in the AQMP. That's the direction from our board. The collaborative process, looking for actions that can achieve emission reductions as described in those measures. We do need to find a way to get, state implementation plan credit for those actions. So that's one of the challenges that we'll be facing going forward. But we're committed to the collaborative approach to the extent we can achieve those reductions with report back to our board on progress. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ian to give a little more detail and go through the presentation, and then we'll be opening it up to comments and questions. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ian McMillan. I'm a planning and rules manager here, and I think Phil covered just about everything, so you're going to hear it all again, but in a little bit more detail. A lot of this has already been covered in the Air Quality Management Plan working group process already. I just want to walk through a little bit of review, some of the details, a little bit more drilled down instead of the 50,000 foot level, maybe bring it down to the 25,000 foot level. As we get into these working groups, it'll start getting more and more detailed as we work through it. First on the agenda, I do want to apologize. We found out that there was a typo on the agenda that was sent out on the email on Friday. This is the actual agenda here. The printed one out front is the same. There was a typo on the third bullet point. We will be talking about the AQMD and CARB board resolutions in this meeting. First off, as I think we all know, air quality has gotten better over the last several decades, considerably better, and that is a real success story. The success story both of the stakeholders involved, as far as all the industries that have done some pretty amazing things to reduce their emissions, as well as various work by community groups, work by government, et cetera. There's real improvement in air quality, and that is something to be applauded. That said, we have a ways to go, right? We still have some of the dirtiest air in the nation. 7 of the worst 10 air quality monitors in the nation are located right here in our basin, and most of these actually in the Inland Empire. And in particular, the concerns right now are ozone and particulate matter, which I think folks already know. The Federal Clean Air Act lays out a process for how to address the emissions and address these air pollutants of concern. What we do know from the Clean Air Act is that if we don't meet the air quality standards on time, then we have some potential sanctions that are out there, and they're rather heavy-handed sanctions. One would be loss of local control of air pollution regulation. Another would be loss of federal transportation funding, and another would be a significant increase to businesses for increased emission offsets for those facilities that would need that. So these are some pretty significant sanctions we could face if we don't meet our air quality goals. This next slide, on slide 4, shows the key pollutant of concern. When it comes to ozone and particulate matter, the key precursor pollutant is nitrogen oxides, NOx. This is emitted from ships, trains, trucks, cars, factories, etc. Gets up into the atmosphere, reacts with other pollutants, reacts with sunlight, and will form ozone and particulate matter. What we see, for example, on the graph on the right, and these are hopefully familiar for folks who've looked through the Air Quality Management Plan, we see that the emissions with existing regulation are scheduled to decline through time, right? So if we look from 2012 to 2023 to 2031, existing regulations on the books already will reduce nitrogen oxides substantially. Unfortunately, we know we need to get lower than that, right? We need in 2023, beyond existing regulations, another 45% reduction. 2031, we need a 55% reduction. So these are some substantial reductions. We've walked through this all already for the Air Quality Management Plan. And when we look at where these emissions are coming from, certainly in the 2012 year, it's mostly from mobile sources, right? That it's not quite 90% emissions from mobile sources. And so that's where we need to spend some considerable time to get these emission reductions that we need. The air quality management plan was approved by our governing board in March. It was also approved by the State Air Resources Board in March after our approval. And this document, rather thick document, besides going into some detail about the emissions inventory that I just very briefly described, also described the path forward, right? And how are we going to get to our key attainment dates in 2023 and 2031? What we did see is that there's sort of four main efforts to try to get to the emission reductions we need. One is through our own control measures, both for stationary sources and mobile sources. There is a state strategy from CARB on mobile sources. Certainly a very big piece of this are going to be incentives, financial and otherwise. And we see that we're going to have to be pursuing those at the same time as everything else. And then some potential legislation as well. And these are a series of parallel paths that we're going to be going on in all of these. Really, our focus today is to kick off the working groups for the mobile source, facility-based mobile source control measures. So it's really just one piece of all this. We aren't going to be doing all of these all at the same time, all through this working group. Certainly, there will be a lot of interaction amongst all of these efforts, though. To drill down just a little bit into these mobile source measures, the AQMP laid out 15 specific measures that were categorized into 5 different groups. There's the emissions growth management, there's the facility-based measures themselves, and then there's the on-road measures, the off-road measures, and the incentives. From those categories, that's where the more specific measures laid out on the right are defined. And so for the working groups we're convening today, we're really looking at just 5 of those measures, not all 15, but 5 would be the main focus. That would be EGMO1 for new development and redevelopment projects, MOB1 for commercial marine ports, MOB2 for rail yards and intermodal facilities, MOB3 for warehouses and distribution centers, and finally MOB4 for commercial airports. Now, as Phil described, we had some considerable discussion during the AQMP development about how to implement these measures. And we are aware that this is an area of substantial concern, and we are committed to pursuing this collaborative process. It is really important that we get buy-in from stakeholders about how to find a path forward. We know that a lot of discussion has happened already about what voluntary measures can be pursued, and that should be an approach that we should really be looking at first. We know that in the past there have been other efforts that are voluntary that have worked to provide some substantial emission reductions. We look at the ports as one example, certainly, and so we want to see what else can be done, right? What can be done on this voluntary path, and we're committed to pursuing that. Certainly, as we go through this, we need to coordinate with the other agencies with regulatory authority over mobile sources. That includes CARB and EPA. One of the things that we also need to do is we need to, as we go through this process, assess progress. And it's not just assess progress on emission reductions, that's certainly a part of it, but is the process working, right? We need to figure out how do we know that. Because ultimately, we need to provide a recommendation to our board, and that's in about a year, a little bit less than that. And our recommendation needs to say whether or not we continue down this process of maybe collaborative effort, voluntary measures are going to get us there. But how do we know? And we need to make that recommendation. Or is there some sort of regulatory path we also need to pursue in parallel? And we might need to pivot to that once we get back to our board. Now, we know that there was a lot of discussion when our board adopted the AQMP about what is the right path forward and how do we move forward, and that's expected in any sort of process like this. I want to just very briefly review what our board, there were several motions that were put forward by our board. I want to briefly review the 3 that passed because these will help us define what we'll be doing moving forward. If there's any difference between what's in the AQMP that we went through all the working group processes, and working groups as opposed to what came out of the board. And it's very, very similar to everything that we described already. So first, there was one motion that passed that is related specifically to one of the facility-based mobile source measures, and that's for commercial airports. And staff was directed to undertake a stakeholder process, like we are beginning right now, and draft for the board's consideration in 2 years' time, by February 2019, a draft indirect source rule for non-aircraft emission sources at commercial airports. We aren't sure at all what that might look like. We weren't given direction by the board to say that regulation needs to look like X, Y, and Z. We're going to be going through this working group process to try to find what that will look like going forward and what voluntary measures might be available for airports, the same way for all the other facility-based measures. When we look at the two other motions that passed from our board, they also relate to mobile sources, but not specifically to the facility-based mobile source measures. The first was on MOB 7 and 8. This is for heavy-duty vehicles, on-road heavy-duty vehicles. One has to do with accelerated deployment of cleaner technologies. The other has to do with accelerated retirement of older technologies. And what we were directed was to pursue not just zero emission, but also near zero emissions when we seek legislative authority for public fleets. What we have also said is that if we are granted that legislative authority, we will then seek amendments to our fleet rules to take advantage of that legislation. And finally, on heavy-duty vehicles, we were directed by our board to pursue the most cost-effective technologies, such as emerging natural gas engines on the heavy-duty fleet, or whatever is the most cost-effective for whatever application is out there. Similarly, a few weeks after our board approved our AQMP, this went to the CARB board, and they had a number of motions that they included in their resolution adopting the AQMP. First, they did approve the state strategy that was identified in the AQMP. They did require an annual report on how the implementation is going of that state strategy. There is also a one-year callback on a report on the metrics for assessing progress. And this is similar to what I had just described a second ago. How do we know if this process is working? Now, the fourth bullet point on here we know has gotten some considerable discussion. So in 1 year, as we read the resolution, CARB staff needs to report back to its board on concepts for an indirect source rule, not with actual draft language itself, but with concepts for an indirect source rule, and any alternatives to control pollution from large freight facilities. And this report back to their board comes after district staff reports to our board. And so we plan to coordinate with CARB as we move forward with this so that we're moving on very similar paths here to try to understand how to get to the goals that we all seek. When it comes to actual regulations, there were two measures related to regulations. The first was in 18 months, CARB staff needs to develop at-birth regulation amendments that achieve up to 100% compliance by 2023 for the LA ports and any other port in the state that is within a top 10% Cal Enviro screen area. Similarly, in 24 months, CARB staff needs to develop a cargo handling equipment regulation to achieve 100% compliance with the zero-emission vehicles for 2030, using that same Cal Enviro screen criteria for at-birth regulations. I want to touch a little bit on the schedule. This schedule is defined in the AQMP and the laying out how we plan to get through the next year or so. First, we, of course, are convening working groups, which was what we're starting today. We're a little bit late on that. We've been trying to ramp up, and we're full speed ahead at this point. Second, we have a progress report for Mobile Source Committee. The Mobile Source Committee did not meet in April, but we will be going to them in May, largely reflecting this meeting and what path we foresee moving forward. We will be holding ongoing working group meetings with all these working groups we're convening today. We have a 6-month progress report in October that will be going back to our Mobile Source Committee to see how we're doing. And finally, I want to focus on this. This really, again, is the key milestone for us. By March of next year, we need to go back to our board with a staff recommendation about what do we do moving forward. Is the process working as far as voluntary collaborative efforts? Are we going to get the emission reductions we need through that process, or is there some role for rulemaking as part of that? We certainly know there are two key considerations as we move forward. Air quality and public health. We know that if we don't get the emission reductions we need, air quality and public health will suffer. And that is not an acceptable situation. We also know that if this process does not work successfully, there could be impacts to the economy, and that's something that we are seeking to minimize and avoid. And we do know that these two considerations don't have to be against each other, right? You can have improvements in air quality, improvements in public health, and an improved economy. And that's what we're seeking to do through this process. We have some proposed objectives for these working groups, and we want to get some feedback from everybody on this, but right now our objectives are to work with you all to identify strategies to implement these facility-based mobile source measures as were laid out in the AQMP. We want to identify voluntary measures and what voluntary actions and projects can be taken to achieve cost-effective emission reductions. We also need to consider for these working groups how other AQMP measures, whether those are the incentives, which are, we understand, critically important, CARB regs, such as the at-birth regulation that they're directed to pursue, or others, how all of that interacts with these facility-based measures. And we're going to have to be discussing that as we move forward over this next year or so. As I mentioned before, we need to identify what are the metrics of success. How do we know if this is working? And we, again, would like some feedback from you all on this. And so we need to know, is what we're doing working? And ultimately, we need to develop the mechanisms to ensure that any voluntary emission reductions are real, enforceable, quantifiable, surplus, and again, as Phil mentioned, they have to be creditable to the SIP, to the State Implementation Plan. How we plan to move forward on this process, on slide 13 here, is we are proposing to do 4 working groups to address these 5 measures, one on EGM01 for new development and redevelopment. We plan to combine ports and rail yards, and then we would do one for warehouses and one for commercial airports. Certainly there are going to be a lot of themes that are similar or the same across all groups or across multiple groups. But there are certainly enough distinct considerations for each of these different entities that we will need to split these folks, these different groups out. We are expecting multiple meetings over the next year, although of course we understand that individual meetings, we're always available for that if folks request it. And our first set of meetings, we're proposing on June 1st and June 2nd to hold the first set of meetings for all 4 working groups on those 2 days. Unless we hear a lot of feedback. Otherwise, we will be sending out some more information on those coming soon. There's a lot that we're going to have to cover through this working group process. We have some potential topics that are listed here on this slide. First, we would like to cover the state of technology. We've done a number of demonstration projects of emerging technologies. There's a lot of different technology that's out there today than was even available, say, 5 years ago. And we want to take a little time to review what those technologies are and how they could work in different applications. We obviously need to spend a lot of time on what sort of voluntary measures and projects are available, and we need to hear back from stakeholders on this. What is out there? What can we look towards to achieve these emission reductions? And how can we take SIP credit for those actions? We certainly are going to have to talk about incentives, financial incentives and otherwise, to help meet these goals. And if it looks like we might need to do something beyond voluntary measures, what are some potential regulatory concepts that we might think about moving forward? And certainly there could be other things we should talk about, and we want to hear feedback on that. Phil did touch on format. This format is not how we plan to hold any future working group meeting where someone coming and speaking at a podium and everybody sitting in the audience. We do want to do this more as an interactive dialogue, a roundtable kind of format. This first introductory meeting lent itself to this. It's a way to reach a wide audience. So we are planning to change that moving forward. We do have a goal as we move forward with this to provide materials to everybody 72 hours in advance. I think we missed that by 1 hour this time. We got 71 hours instead of 72, but we are shooting for that 72-hour goal moving forward. And the point of this, again, is we want this to be collaborative. We want to work with you. We want to get your meaningful feedback, and we need to hear from you all on this. We do plan to probably not webcast future meetings, but we will provide conference call-in ability. This particular call right now is there's no ability for folks to speak on the line, but in future meetings, we will allow folks to speak on the line for the working groups. As I mentioned, we are seeking your input right now just on this very initial process, schedule, objectives. So what topics should we be considering? What metrics should we be considering to help us define whether or not we're successful in our efforts? What voluntary measures and what voluntary projects should be explored? And certainly, what else, right? We're open to comments and thoughts right now. And we'd also like to hear from folks if they want to be members of these working groups, if they want to actually have membership, or are they just an interested stakeholder? Finally, there's contact information for myself and Dan Garcia staff if you have questions on this process moving forward. And with that, I will be quiet and we'll take questions and comments from the audience. Thank you.
And while people are formulating your questions, I just wanted to add that I had to step out to take a call from Richard Corey from ARB, who just returned from Australia. And I really wanted to reinforce the collaborative partnership concept, not just with all of you, but also in terms of how we work with the other agencies. I think CARB and we worked very closely together in the development of the AQMP and the SIP. And of course, we couldn't have done that without EPA. So EPA is a key partner in all of this as we move forward, particularly as we try to think out how can we work on the credits. And I know we're very fortunate today to have Amy Zimfer and Francisco Doñez as part of our group here. And you know, again, on the collaborative aspect of this, to those of you that were involved in the development of the, I'll say the diesel collaboratives, the West Coast Collaborative, very similar concept in terms of the development of the working groups. And those, they looked at ag, they looked at off-road, they looked at marine, construction equipment. And I sort of see the same concept applying here in terms of how we develop these working groups. And Ian identified those working groups. And so I think that, at least from my experience, some of the lessons learned were those meetings started with a lot of you can't do this, you can't do that, and we had to get past that. And we had to get to, let's really look at this from what could be done. And don't look at it from a limitation, well, we need this and this, forget that. Look at it from the perspective of, this would be a great project. And then we can figure out how do we get the resources, or how do we get the technical know-how, or how do we get the timing, or whatever it takes. So I'd really ask you to be creative in that concept. We certainly hope to be. I know that, again, as we all move forward, we go through those working group processes, we'll be meeting, whether it's monthly, bi-monthly, or whatnot. We'll be doing the same thing in our approach in terms of meeting with CARB, meeting with the EPA, and all of those issues. So I know that there's a lot of anxiousness and trepidation about all of that coordination, and I think that we have to really work together to try to address that. Our goal is to be successful in that regard, and I think Dr. Fine has a few comments as well.
Thanks. So we'll get to questions in a moment. I just want to mention a couple other things that may head off a couple questions that are coming. So as you know, if you're involved with the AQMP process, kind of the architect of these local mobile source measures was Henry Hogo, who has retired. So, and a lot of staff in that group has retired over the past, few months. So one of the reasons we're just a little bit late on that 1 month schedule is we had to at least reconstitute that group from existing staff. That's why Ian is filling in that role for now, and Dan Garcia is also filling in that role. We are working hard to hire folks and to fill out that group. So the names and faces may change. They may be the same going forward. We don't know yet, but we are committed to staffing up that group and having the internal resources to make this work. The second thing I wanted to address was we talked about the board adoption resolution on MOB 04 on the airports. And essentially what that told us to do is in 2 years' time come back and have a potential rule language available for board consideration. But if you also heard the discussion, that was, again, only if other types of approaches were not yielding results. So it's actually quite similar to what was already written in the AQMP and exists for MOB 01, 02, and 03. So the path forward on that, just because of that board resolution, isn't too different. We'll find out a lot more in that 1 year report back to the board, whether we're going to move to rulemaking or we're making progress, and that'll be a time even for MOB 04 that the board can give us feedback of yes, we're going to follow through with that resolution and go to rulemaking, or hey, you've made great progress, and the board can always give us new direction on that depending on progress. So staff doesn't believe that that board resolution MOB04 changes the process too much. It may mean that, you know, depending on timing around that 1-year time frame, we may need to start drafting something that could be rule language, but again, it's going to be up to our board in that 1-year report back to kind of give us that direction for the next year. So those are only 2 things I wanted to mention. I guess with that, we can open it up to questions. Anyone who would like to just come up and speak into the mic. And again, we're open to questions and dialogue. This isn't so much about testimony or statements.
Wayne, Phil, Ian, Kurt, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Look forward to continuing the collaborative process. As you know, the 2 ports, I'm Rick Cameron, Port of Long Beach. The 2 ports have already been engaging many of the same stakeholders that are probably in this room as it relates to our Clean Air Action Plan update. We're going to continue that process moving forward. We had a draft discussion document out. We had a 90-day review, as you know, and we're hoping to get the next draft version out later in the June timeframe. We're still working out that schedule right now. So as we're moving forward with our process, I hope that we can align so it's not confusing. As you know, as you alluded to in your presentation, there's been a lot of moving parts in the last couple months. And so we want to make sure that we utilize the process from everybody, the things that are going on, whether it's CARB, here at SCAQMD, what's happening at the 2 ports with our Clean Air Action Plan. I think it's going to be critical so that we're not confusing everybody, and we can somewhat keep in alignment with where we all hope to be, which is not going to rulemaking. At least that's my goal, if we can avoid that. So I just wanted to thank you for this kind of introductory working group meeting. I know Chris is going to say a few words as well from the LA perspective. The one question I did have is, with all the MOB1s out there, and you just clarified for the airport one, but this is not the starting point of the rulemaking process. This is separate from that, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
The approach is to look for a collaborative approach.
Okay.
How voluntary reduction, seeing if there are mechanisms to make that, you know, creditable to the SIP,
Okay.
and reporting back to our board on progress. And if progress isn't being made or our board decides that rulemaking is needed, then kind of that second year is going to be looking at rulemaking.
So that would start that process then. The clock starts for the rulemaking process at that point in time?
Well, I just want to say, it's not hard and fast. It's not, we're going to go a year, right? We're going to be working together. And I think as long as collectively we're working together and we're seeing progress and we're seeing results, that's what we want. But if we're working together and we see stall, or we see no progress, or we see that we're not getting where we need, we can then go to the board and say, you know, we're trying, we're doing these things, we're not seeing the kind of cooperation, collaboration, or partnership that we think is necessary to move in this fashion.
I'm asking, so understood, and I appreciate that.
Okay.
So then there's a separate clock for that then. If you ended up going, either you get to the board in the March timeframe, or it's not working out midway through the summer and you go back and you go, you know what, it's not happening. We need to move forward with rulemaking if that ended up being a recommendation. So that's my question. When does that clock start?
Well,
I guess it starts if that recommendation was
right.
made,
I mean,
correct?
we come back, you know, we have a commitment to come back to committee in 6 months. So that's one check-in. But again, if staff is feeling like we're not making any progress, we can come back to report on committee and say, you know, we're asking your feedback, but we think we need to take a different direction. And the process for a rulemaking and the process for what could be a voluntary collaborative approach, there's a lot of overlap there. What are we talking about? We're talking about actions and measures to reduce emissions, right? We're talking about what's cost effective and what's feasible and what the stakeholders can do. And that's the same thing you would do in rulemaking. So if you know, just because we pivot to rulemaking, all that work up to that point was not wasted, that the same type of information is going to move into that next phase, whatever that next phase is.
Okay, I appreciate that, because I've had a lot of questions from our board about that, because of, like I said before, so many new things have popped up in the last couple of months. I just want to make sure we provide our board with an update, because this question comes up as we're moving forward with our Clean Air Action Plan update. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I actually don't have a lot to add. I had some questions on process, and I think you clarified them in the presentation, so thank you for that. I'm really here to tell you that we're ready to work. We know that there's a lot of discussions that need to be had, and we know that in order to develop measures that we are going to help you achieve the goals you've set in your AQMP, we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and do some work. We're ready to do it. And the process Rick referred to earlier, a moment ago, was that we're doing our Cleaner Action Plan. There, I'm not closer, sorry. The process that we're going through with the Cleaner Action Plan is occurring in parallel. And so that's going to, the discussions about that, I think are going to need to play into this a little bit. So we'll have to figure out how that works. I don't have much more. I think you raised in your working groups that you wanted to set up the questions I had. The only thing that we have, and you've heard this from us before, is how do you find enforceable, SIP creditable measures as it relates to us that involve sources we don't control? And there's arguments about whether we control some better or more than others and so forth. Don't expect an answer today. I just wanted to pose that as a challenge. There are different sources that are at the ports, and they're related to ports, but our control over them is limited. So want to make sure that's part of the dialogue when we talk about SIP creditable measures and so forth. But other than that, thank you for engaging in this process, and we look forward to working with you.
Thanks, Chris. I guess I just want to say to both you and Rick that there certainly is a lot of recognition in terms of the work that's been done and even the model for success that's been done through the CAPS previously. So we will be looking at that. And as you guys know from our comments previously, it was all about timing from our perspective. And you know, I certainly look to you and to the working group that'll be formed there to really show to a lot of people how you can reach out to the community, how you can work with industry, how you can work with the regulators to develop that plan and do it in a way that meets all of our goals. So really appreciate the work that you've done, your comments, and know that we'll be working closely together. And on that note, Bill.
Hi, I was sitting over there trying to speculate when the last time I was here on a Monday, you know, and I can't remember.
Do you like it? Should we do this more often, or
Parking
no?
is a lot easier. So
I'm sure
yeah,
we'll keep it consistent. Then we'll try to do this in a very great long time.
yeah. Actually, Monday is a great day for me. But I'm Bill Lamar. I'm the executive director of the California Small Business Alliance. I think it may be here in the presentation, and I think Phil touched on it in his recent comments, but I want to bring up the subject of incentives. And I know that you have it on slide 14, status of incentives, but under proposed near-term objectives of working groups, under slide 12, it's missing completely. And what concerns me is whether it's mobile source and or stationary sources, we're going to be doing a lot of window shopping here when you talk about evaluating the feasibility of certain technologies. In the case of my constituents, you also need to talk about affordability and do they make economic sense for the amount of emissions that will be gained from them. So what I guess where I'm going with this is I would like to see a regular reports on staff's progress, and if I think my recollection is from our past AQMP advisory group meetings, you were looking to the business sector too for ideas on public-private partnerships too. As to what progress is being achieved by all of us to get firm commitments pledges, firm pledges, or money in the bank, however you want to characterize it, for incentives to make these strategies actually happen. And then also, have those reported to the committee or to the governing board at whatever schedule you're comfortable with. I know that was Henry was sort of hampered the last year or so in his reports, and I think that was because there just seemingly wasn't any visible progress in getting those pledges and getting those firm commitments. As much as we all love Henry, but I mean, I know it's a daunting task, but it's something that I think we'd all feel comfortable if we knew that what we're identifying, what we're deciding on, is also it's in our ability to pay for. So.
Thanks, Bill. David, if I could just comment briefly on one of the comments that Bill made about sort of the incentives aspect. So I don't think we've had a chance to report back on a lot of the efforts that we're doing up in Sacramento. And I'm not sure if people are familiar with AB 1278, which is our smog abatement bill. I'm going to look to our council to make sure I don't go too far out on a limb. But we passed out of committee, and in essence what that bill would do, it would delay smog testing for model year 6 or less. So let's say you had a car and it was 6 years old. Normally you would go get that vehicle smog tested. And under our proposed legislation, what we found is that looking at model year 6s, the failure rate is less than 5%. It's 3 to 5%. And so in what we're proposing is that instead of testing in model year 6, you'd now test in 8 years. And so the 2 years that you get, the fee that you would normally have paid would now go into, in essence, the Carl Moyer Fund. And we would get, I think, 4 to 6 times the benefits from a NOx perspective that you would get otherwise. So we see this as a tremendous win because the consumer, you all don't have to go and get your smog tested and get the certificate and spend your time that you would have to do otherwise, and we'd still be getting a clean air benefit. And that particular legislation would result in over $166 million statewide. So it's a good program across the state. I think our share would be close to $100 million. We're also looking at a number of other measures. Just last week, I was in Washington, D.C. and presented to the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, and we talked about a national infrastructure bill. I'm sure many of you have heard the numbers, $1 trillion for a national infrastructure bill. We talked with those air agencies about a clean air fund, much in the same way you have a super fund for hazardous waste sites, you have the state revolving funds for water. We were looking at a fund that could be utilized or come out of that infrastructure bill. And if we looked at 5% over 10 years, it was close to, what was it, $5 billion a year for 10 years, 50 billion? Yeah. So that would do a lot of good, and it would provide a lot of cleaner opportunities, incentives. The challenge is that, what we heard was that, well, it really shouldn't be just for non-attainment. What about for maintenance, or what about for toxics? So there are many issues that go, but it seems that there's a good opportunity to pursue that. And so we'll be doing that as well. We're also looking at additional opportunities, but we'll be more than happy to provide any other updates on what we're doing for the incentives. And I know we've reached out to some of you for assistance, particularly in DC. So I just wanted you to know that, Bill. And
so I just want to add, so this presentation and these working groups, it's a little light on discussing the incentives, and that was for a reason, because there is a parallel process that was committed to in the AQMP for setting up working groups on helping to get collaboration and consensus and coalitions around raising money. We've run forward before we've convened the working group because that's the way the legislative session is happening right now. So, but we've been reporting back to our legislative committee, but there still is plans to bring together a working group to help figure out where the money might be coming from. As far as where the money goes to, that comes a little bit closer to these working groups because depending on where this goes with the voluntary measures and how incentives help get the equipment out there that's needed and how that plays into how these mobile source measures play out is something that we can discuss within these working groups. But raising the money is probably outside the scope of these working groups, but we may want to make sure that incentives are, that you're not precluded perhaps from taking advantage of incentives in some of these areas.
David.
Good morning. Thank you, David Pettit from NRDC. I have one substantive comment and one procedural. Substantively, when on the slide, I guess it's 14, working group process potential topics, I'd like to see SB1 added to that. I think it casts a pall, if you will, over the work of the Marine Ports and Rail Yards group and the warehouse group, because if we can't get rid of the diesel fleet and swap it out for something a lot better, I think a lot of some of the negative consequences that Ian talked about are more likely to happen. I'm reading Game of Thrones, and when Ian was talking, I was thinking about dragons filling the sky, and that's what it's going to be to our economy if we don't get into attainment for ozone. And I think SB1 has a potential of being a huge impediment to that. I know that Mary Nichols is saying publicly, "Oh, not a problem. We can do indirect source rules." I think that the CTA and the ATA have a different view about that, and that's something that the whole we in the room, are going to need to deal with if we're going to make these committees actually be relevant. And then just a procedural question: if we're going to have 4 working groups, let's say hypothetically I were interested in 3 of them, it would be good to have them sort of all meet the same day. I mean, it takes me an hour to get out here. Come on, give me a break, guys. I mean, it'd be nice if I don't have to come out here every day, and I think a lot of us are in the same boat. Thank you.
So we're kind of thinking of having four working groups over 2 days, so at least that might be a little better. If we could fit them all into 4 days, might be a little, and all 4 into 1 day, could be a little tough, but we'll see. We'll see how big they are and how related they are. Some may be more conducive to having back-to-back. Yeah.
Good morning. Todd Campbell with Clean Energy. Thank you for holding this introductory forum. Appreciate it. And I like Monday. It's good. A couple comments. One, I wanted to mention or some support for David Pettit's trying to discuss SB1. I think SB1 has some implications, and clarifying what those implications actually are, I think will be important. I have heard from various sources from the Air Resources Board that SB1 is very limited in application. In other words, it only affects the health and safety code that affects the authority of the Air Resources Board. It does not affect the authority of the ports or the district, which I think is very important for all of us to understand. So certainly, it may stop the Air Resources Board from moving forward with a rule that would affect existing trucks out there, but that does not preclude us from moving ahead. So further clarification on that would be great. Second, I wanted to reaffirm and encourage all those in this room, as well as I know that the Air Quality Management District is working on this, the important need to move our legislature to find and identify funding sources for incentives. Since SB1, we have actually worked in strong coordination with other stakeholders to get a Dear Colleague letter of at least, I think, now 9 Assembly members, with also some very positive exchanges with the Speaker and the Senate Pro Tem. This is an effort to find those incentive dollars that we desperately need to reduce emissions in the basin. And so clearly, if anyone in the audience is interested in helping us with that letter, it would be nice to have 15, 20, maybe all of them on the letter. And then for my questions, I have 2. Number one, I think that the LA and Long Beach port authorities are working very hard to reduce emissions down at the ports. And we don't want to discourage their momentum, clearly. So I guess in the discussions that we will be having at these workshops, will we be talking about or outlining what success is in certain timeframes? So in other words, if the Clean Air Action Plan achieves, a number of reductions, will that give the port some certainty, or the ports some certainty that they might not have a rule that follows up, and something that they don't foresee, that they have full vision as to what they're doing, and they're able to have some credibility when they talk to their stakeholders in terms of the regulatory space. And then finally, with the other sources, obviously Airport Authority, you received a blessing from the board. I know that the Air Resources Board has the ability to move forward with some ISRs for the other categories. Is this more information that you'd like to work with the Air Resources Board and try to do some collaborative approach? Or do you envision, because I'm just trying to further confirm the objective, are you hoping to do maybe a year's worth of voluntary effort to see if we can get some momentum? And then if you don't find that you're getting to where you need to be, that's when you may actually take this issue up once more with the board to see if you can seek authority or approval from that board.
Well, let me address the last one first on the airports. Yeah, you're right, Todd, that the board, I think you said, blessed us with the airport issue. And, as Phil has said, I think many times, the process between a voluntary approach and a rulemaking approach are very similar when you're looking at what goes into all the aspects associated with defining the inventory, the emission reductions, the goals, the timings, and all of those particular issues. And I think that, clearly with where ARB's board directed them, I think that if you look at both ARB's board and our board, the common denominator is they're all about results. And the question is, how do you get those results, and what's the time frame, what's the tools that you use? And I think what Richard and I have talked about is working coordinated fashion on all of these issues, much in the same way that we did with the AQMP, and so that we have a good understanding. We'll have a regular check-in, as I said before. And I think that as long as we're demonstrating progress and showing results, that's going to be the important part. There are different mechanisms for a regulatory approach. And I think that as long as we satisfy the EPA criteria, I think that's going to be one of the big challenges. What's going to be the ultimate framework for that to take place will be one of the challenges. But I think that there is certainly enough energy and I would say a lot of desire to do what we can. So I'm saying that with the recognition that we're going to try to go along a certain path, and to the extent that we can be as one, whether it be AQMD, ARB, and EPA, great. There may come a time, though, where we say, this part isn't working for whatever particular reason, or it's not yielding enough of a result for our particular entity. We're not there yet, but I think that at least at the start, our intent is to work together to define those issues so that there is that common understanding, and so that when something may arise, we all understand what the ramifications of that are. So, Phil?
I covered most of what I was going to add, but just to get back to SB1, definitely could be a topic of discussion, but I think you'll find some reluctance by our legal staff or other legal staffs to start getting into legal arguments when there isn't a case in front of them. I would say that I think there's enough perhaps uncertainty in the impact of that provision in SB1 that it's not going to change our approach going forward in the working groups. And if it turns out that it does cause some legal issues as we go forward with perhaps some of the measures, especially if they go regulatory, we'll have to deal with it at the time. But until I think until it gets tested, I think we're moving forward as if it wasn't there.
Okay. Good morning. Dr. Tom Williams, representing the Citizens Coalition for a Safe Community, also Sierra Club Transportation Committee, and the LA 32 Neighborhood Council. Basic issue. Why do you have communications, electronic, you even use emails? Because that's what is easy now. You should have a web page for each of the major groups that you have that includes, after 40 years of project management, a scope, a schedule, resources, and a draft as to what you want now, and with a big title at the top, to be revised, so that you have an electronic committee or you have electronic communications. It can be online, real time, and it makes it easy for everybody to see where we're going, what we've achieved, and what we'll get there. In fact, for the CAAP, Garcetti went down there and said, I want to see numbers and schedule. For any good project, you gotta know where you're going. Once we had a problem in Korea. Our vice president came in and said, you don't have an outline. How do you know what you're doing? He came back 3 months later and he was really angry. You haven't changed the outline. What's wrong? In web pages, you can do track changes. You can have PDF downloads that people can actually work on while they're not sitting over here. And that's a very important thing. And we call it e-committees, so that 4 or 5 people can be making review comments on the same EIR at the same time. They just put it in as track changes. So I would highly recommend, rather than coming out here on a Monday when there's no cafe, no coffee available, no sweet buns, put it online so that everybody can see where we're going, what we've achieved, and what we have left to go. That's one. Then, what's the goal of this effort? It's going to take 2 years. What's the goal? Which means the general achievement at the end, such as 50% reduction of the NOx in 2023 or 2031, or both. What's the goal? Then, at this time, with a date down at the bottom to be revised, what are your objectives? What are the objectives that all of these programs are going to be recommending? And when, where, get it into some form that we can react to, rather than generalities as to, for me, coming from Kansas, I could look at the Kansas City Southern Railroad, Mexico, and the fact that they have a 6 million TEU port right now moving containers without trucks. We kind of summarize it down to get on rail. And that has a lot of implications regarding air pollution sources. That's why please keep the ports and the railroads in the same working group. Elsewise, I have to come out here for 2 groups. So there's another issue as to what you are going to do about a thing called the High Desert Corridor. 60 miles of logistics corridor that has been proposed, is funded by Measure M, and is going forward. However, it's outside your air basin. But all the trucks that are going to feed Palmdale have to go through my district, which I'm kind of concerned about, SR 710, and a lot of other areas which have significant air issues. Colton has significant air issues. So if you took half of the trips to Colton and put them to Palmdale, would that affect the air? So there's a lot of things like that. But my basic element at this stage, let's get online, have an E-committee or an E-working group for each one that has links, source documents, projections, things like that. So one of the key elements for the ports, how many TEUs per day? And that includes empties. And one of the problems right now is oftentimes if you see a projection, 20 million, 40 million by the year X loaded versus empties. Well, the empties have to go back too, and they have to be trucked, and they have to be trained and all that. So there's some forecast issues. So in the E-committee page, put in assumptions and provide a link rather than the Mercator report that's only available at this point and this point, but put all of the assumptions in there. So scope, schedule, resources, assumptions. Hope we can get it done before I die. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, those are good suggestions. We intend to make all materials available, and if there's more interactive tools we can use online, we can try that. I assure you that everything that all materials that exist related to these working groups and these measures either have been provided to everybody here via email or are in the AQMP itself. But as we divide into different working groups, yes, there will be separate web pages for each working group. Materials will be there, and we could see how to make it a little more interactive.
Basically, do you have an outline for the rules 2 years from now? If not, why not?
Well, that's a subject of the working group process, so we're not presupposing what that outline might look like. Thanks, Tom. Nancy.
Can I just?
Oh, Ian,
Just
go ahead.
very briefly, we do actually have a web page already that's just very beginning, and we're planning to expand it. So that's all.
Hi, thanks very much. I have a few questions, comments on behalf of my gateway cities that I represent. So, Ian, you mentioned when you talked about stakeholder input and you talked about membership in these working groups, and you said memberships or interested stakeholders. So I'm just wondering, as the process, could we expect to see something very similar to the AQMP advisory group, where we have the members kind of around the table, we have other folks that are interested in the room, everybody can make input and comment. So is that what we'd expect to see?
Yes, I think that's what we're
All right,
looking
great,
for.
good. A suggestion, hearing, of course, you mentioned or acknowledged in the beginning that while you have several different working groups, there are going to be some common issues, and then also the question was raised by Bill about incentives, and you responded that you have a process that's looking into funding opportunities. So I'm wondering if, I know it's hard to schedule meetings, but perhaps some joint meetings down the road for these groups to bring everything together into focus so that we can see what's happening with the funding efforts, how that feeds into the incentives, and sort of what the common issues are between the groups. So there might be some opportunities when that's appropriate. Lastly, I did want to ask for a little bit more information about your slide 14 on the working group process and potential topics. That slide, and I understand why, is very focused on the MOB measures. But for my gateway cities, I'm very interested in the EGM 01, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you think you might be heading with that.
Well, looking at slide 14, I think all of those things also apply to EGM 01. For EGM 01 in particular, there is an example out there. The San Joaquin Valley APCD has a rule, has an indirect source rule for new development and redevelopment projects. And I'm not going to presuppose the results of the working group process, but I think there's some things about that rule that we may and there's some things that we may want to do differently. So I think there are opportunities in that area in terms of the types of, say, construction equipment that is used in some of the development projects. I think, some of the types of infrastructure that goes into some of those development projects. And those are the types of things that San Joaquin has looked at. But I think different from San Joaquin, we're not necessarily interested in collecting fees if we can avoid it. I mean, there might be an option for that, but we're much more focused on achieving the reductions.
Great, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Gail Shiomoto-Lore, and I'm representing the City of Mission Viejo. First of all, thank you for this opportunity to have this introductory session. Representing a local government, Mission Viejo in particular is interested in EGM 01 and the focus on development and new development. And I'm looking at the room here, I noticed there are, several representatives from councils of government, such as Nancy and San Diego, the Orange County Council of Governments. We have the San Bernardino County Transportation Commission. We also have representatives from SCAG here. One of the sensitivities what I'd like to just share with you is noticing on slide 13 that you're proposing the first set of meetings on June 1st and June 2nd. Many of us attend the SCAG Regional Council and Policy Committee meetings, which are the first Thursday of the month. We represent our elected officials there. We must be there. And I just wanted to express our request for your sensitivity and consideration in trying to perhaps eliminate that conflict either in this meeting and in subsequent meetings. Thank you.
Okay.
We'll take that into account. That's good feedback. Thank you.
Florence?
Hello, how are you today? I'm Florence Caribbean with the Del Olmo Action Committee, and I'm going to kind of sketch out the relevance of the work you're doing with the community that we represent by mentioning that our Executive Director, Cynthia Babbage, after a tremendous amount of effort and work, is achieving locating a park in the community. It will be called the Wishing Tree Park, and it's in the final stages of development. Parks are certainly relevant to the work that you're doing. Also, we've had 2 properties in the community that are undergoing change. One of them is a place where DDT contamination from Montrose was in stormwater that rolled through the property, and there's been a lot of effort made to make sure that that property was not used in inappropriate ways that might endanger public health, going back and forth with one option proposed by the developers being a warehouse. So warehouses in the LA area might take on a different scope and a different picture as time goes by. And the other property is the Farmer Brothers property. It is our understanding that when the work to demolish the Farmer Brothers factory and all the issues with that is finished, that it will be a truck loading facility. So I just make the point that the warehouses and the industries associated with the warehouses and the traffic are all in play, I think, at this point. I have spent time reviewing the minutes from the mobile source meeting when indirect sources were discussed, and I prepared a set of notes for myself on the things that the committee agreed the Air District has the authority to do, and I'd be happy to share that little summary if it was helpful. And also, I understood that you had some questions on what topics the work group should be addressing. And from a community perspective, the one topic that's of so much importance to community members is the impact of traffic on the lives of community members and the steps that could be taken to reduce that impact. And this work should have a focus on schools and other sensitive land uses. What steps could be taken? Possibly sound walls, trees, buffer zones, air filtration systems in schools. Clearly, low emission or no emission vehicles make sense, and that's right in line with what you're planning. And also, I think, an earlier commenter mentioning rail lines, an evaluation of rail lines, how they might be utilized, where they are now, what might happen in the future, and what their capacities are. Also, what new warehouses are planned and where are they planned, and how can the district provide input on that important process? What matrix should each group consider to determine progress? And from a community point of view, community members and their representatives need to have a full stakeholder role in this process. One possible metrics: how effective is the district working to have effective community input with effort to develop matrix that reflect in a meaningful way that the community input was incorporated? What voluntary measures should be explored? Generous good neighbor policies, perhaps, parks, green space, bike trails, sound walls, buffers with real meaningful community input. What matrix should each group consider to determine the voluntary measures that should be explored? And I think I laid out some of that. So my bottom line message here is, don't leave community representatives out of the dialogue. Don't leave them on the fringe of the dialogue. Incorporate them and keep that good neighbor policy and the things that can be done to lessen the impact on the communities as one of your top priorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good ideas.
Hi, Lacey Buckingham with Clean Energy. We are very excited to work with you and figure out solutions that we can achieve in the near term. Today I'm going to speak primarily on MOB 3 and MOB 4 regarding the audience that we recommend including in these workshops. A primary goal of the warehouse and distribution center measures to reduce on-road emissions generated from medium and heavy-duty trucks associated with these facilities. As such, Clean Energy suggests that the SCAQMD consider a broad-based approach that impacts any facility that generates truck trips. That would include any facility where Class 4 to 8 trucks go to pick up items, including but not limited to big box warehouses, distribution and fulfillment centers, sorting centers, last mile delivery centers, manufacturing facilities, aggregate material facilities such as gravel and sand, food distribution, farms, fuel depots, bulk liquid depots, and USPS mail centers. The measure would classify facilities based on the number of outbound truck trips each facility generates on a monthly, annual, and daily basis. And the facility would be required to have a certain percentage of those trips utilize low NOx and zero emission vehicles. That would be phased in over time and until 100% of outbound trips are utilizing near zero or zero emission vehicles. The vast majority of these facilities use third parties for hire carriers to provide trucking services. However, some own their own vehicles. In both cases, it would be the responsibility of the facility owner to meet the compliance requirement, either by requiring their third party for hire carriers purchase the trucks, or they purchase the trucks themselves. This broad-based approach would not single out a specific business sector. The strategy would require significant incentives to purchase the low NOx trucks, and it is important to note that due to the logistical requirements, a majority of these trucks are operating almost entirely within the South Coast Air Basin, creating a perfect opportunity to achieve immediate, real, and tangible emission reductions. We'd recommend a similar measure at airports, and I'll submit this in writing to you guys.
Thank you.
I was just going to ask whether you can submit that, but you answered my question, so.
Good morning. My name's Tim Poley. I'm with Airlines for America. We're based in Washington, D.C., and I represent basically the nation's major airlines, both cargo and passenger carriers. A lot of folks are complaining about being out here on a Monday. I started on Sunday to get out here, so hopefully that's an indication of how seriously we take our responsibilities, and we're looking forward to working with you all as we go forward here. With those things in mind, something that would be extremely helpful to us as we look toward the process going forward is to understand exactly what the schedule is going to be as soon as possible. We have some logistical issues, if you will, to participate, and it would just be helpful to have those. I also think it would be, in terms of substantive issues, be very helpful. A couple of times you have referred to getting what you need and understanding precisely what that means in the context of each particular measure. I think it would help frame the discussion. And certainly when we're looking at other elements of the state program going forward with sources that are at airports, the state has a suite of regulations that affect our ground support equipment. And so obviously that's going forward, and understanding how those measures relate to whatever we're thinking about doing in this context, I think is going to be very important to take into consideration. So basically those two things, to get a little bit more of an understanding of what the schedule is and kind of the framing of how MOB4 especially is going to go forward. But the main thing I want to do is to express our support for the process, and that we're here to participate, and really looking forward to working closely with you as we develop the way forward here. Okay. Thank you.
Good morning. Having been introduced by Gail, sorry for the voice here, thought I'd better introduce myself as Steve Smith with San Bernardino County Transportation Authority. Again, thank you for the opportunity, and we look forward to a great deal of interaction. In fact, one of the questions I had was, we have 24 local cities, actually, and then the county of San Bernardino, who is here. I haven't looked back to see who else of our cities may be here. But they may not be able to be involved directly in the working groups. Would there be an opportunity for outside presentations, for just getting more information out there so it's more broadly understood?
Yeah, absolutely. Just like the AQMP, if any group wants us to come and speak about where we are in the process and what we're looking at, we're absolutely willing to do that. I would suggest, though, that we give it a couple working groups so there is something to report on, because otherwise it's going to be very general like they heard today. But sure, we're perfectly willing at any point to come out.
Great. And that might be at both our technical committee level and the board level. And you guys have been out there before, so, we appreciate that. The other question was, I guess is kind of like technical support, analytical support. And I realize you did a lot of analysis as part of the AQMP itself, but there might be some additional need as we sort through what works, what doesn't work, what's cost effective, what's not, and so forth. What sort of resources do you think you might have, realizing you're reconstituting your group? So,
well, like I mentioned before, in terms of internal staff resources, we are gearing up to fill some of the vacancies that were recently created. I think if an issue comes up that requires an in-depth study that could be done in the timeframes we need, then we can always discuss, some outside contractors to do that work for us.
Okay.
So that's been typical of other rulemakings that we've done on the stationary source side, where if we need some outside input, outside review, or outside analysis, we can do that.
Yeah, the time frame looks like it'll be kind of tight, so fitting all that in there is going to be a little bit of a challenge. But sometimes whether it's economics or cost effectiveness or whatever, it's always good to have that sort of information.
I know there's ongoing truck trip studies that Ian can probably talk more about than I can, but the timing of that will be a challenge for some of the stuff we're trying to do. But there are some studies in the works on that.
Right. And one area, for example, is our curiosity on out-of-state trucks, which represent a huge part of the issue here, and just better understanding, how you would have to reach them, have an impact on that. And as you know, we signed on to the ultra low NOx petition that you guys worked on, and so I don't know what's going to be happening with that, but it's one of those other unknowns.
Steve, let me just sort of tell you, when I was in DC last week, I did have a chance to meet with Chris Grenler and EPA senior staff, and we talked about the ultra-low NOx commitment, and EPA at the time reiterated their commitment to continue to move forward to begin the rulemaking on that. So at least as of last week, it was certainly encouraging. I would say that I'm probably further encouraged because we also met with most of the engine manufacturers, with the American Trucking Association, and all of them are consistent in their desire for a national rule. They don't want to see this patchwork, and so I think that as long as we can stress the importance of that national rule collectively, I think that we'll be okay.
Very good. Thank you.
Angelo?
Hi there. Angelo Logan with East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice and the Urban and Environmental Policy Institute. So I'm just going to reiterate some of the comments that were made earlier, maybe elaborate a little bit more on the stakeholder process. I want to encourage you all to really take serious the a balanced stakeholder approach. So not just in terms of, you know, the folks that do this as a profession or in the field, but really folks that are in the communities and residents that are directly impacted by these measures that would be developed. So both in the formal process, the stakeholder process, in the working group process, but also in the way in which you reach out to stakeholders. I think you need special attention to local residents. And so to that end, I think that it's really important to think about time and location of putting together the working group meetings. So for specifically the port working groups, to think about the harbor area and the times in which stakeholders, specifically residents, can attend those meetings. And I think, again, both in the working group process, but then also just in the general outreach in the community. So having folks that could sit on the working group, but also thinking about how you reach out to local residents. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela.
Good morning, Brandon Matson with BizFed. Just a couple comments. First off, as far as process, BizFed would support a smaller setting, I think, as was clarified in the presentation today. Just wanted to put that on the record. Also, we support getting the slides well in advance. I know you mentioned no later than 72 hours, so that's a good step forward. We appreciate that. As far as objectives, again, finding a voluntary solution is what we're here for, and I just want to clarify that again at the start. The single focus is finding a voluntary solution. So if you could clarify that as I wrap up here. And then secondly, if we are making progress, how can we work with, or how can the district work with ARB to allow us to go forward with voluntary measures? I know that they've got the ISR concept that has brewed out. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Brandon. I know that on the opening comments, I know Phil addressed that, I addressed that in terms of the collaborative partnership approach. I think I also talked about how we intend to work very closely with ARB and with EPA on all of those aspects. So I think we'll be, well, let me restate that. We will be addressing all of the issues that you raised. And as far as the input that we received thus far, there's a lot of really good ideas with regards to some of the scheduling, the objectives, the availability of documents. I think there are some challenges, so I think we'll be able to incorporate a lot of what was said as we move forward. Some of the issues I guess I'm a little concerned about, particularly on the E-committee aspect. I mean, just from my perspective, if you did a E-committee real time, it would constantly be changing, and you really wouldn't know where you are because it's in a constant state. So it's something that I'm going to have to be a little bit more comfortable with, but I think we will definitely look into it. Tom, as thought you raised a lot of really good ideas, so we'll see what we can accomplish. This really is supposed to be a dialogue, so again, we apologize for the formality in which it's set up. But if there's any other comment or if there's any other dialogue, and while that's going on, I'll ask Ian if there's anything you wanted to add.
No, I think we're okay.
Phil?
So we got an email and then a few comments about the timing of the next working group meeting. So we'll be reaching out to make sure key people can be there. But I will say it's definitely going to be call-in like we typically do with working groups. So being here in person is not necessarily, but we heard some comments for some conflicts that we might want to try to avoid. So those dates aren't set in stone. Having said that, we'd really like to schedule these 3, 4, 5 weeks in advance so people can make their plans. So we'll be working on that.
So I know I acknowledged EPA. ARB, Heather, are you here? There you are. So was there anything inconsistent from your perspective with what we said that you need clarification? Great. Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Phil to wrap it up.
All right. So as Wayne said, thanks for all your comments. I think again, the next meetings are going to be much more interactive discussion. It's harder for us to ask questions and harder for you to ask each other questions in this format. So we'll be moving forward. It'll look a little bit more like the AQMP advisory groups. There is one difference. Those are Brown Act meetings. So we don't want these to be Brown Act meetings. So we'll have the same setup, open to the public. We will be taking requests for people who want to be a member versus interested parties. But we will reserve the right. We don't want the membership of a working group to be too one-sided or one entity represented by 6 people. So that's when we'll have to try to make sure we can make some distinction. But it's just a matter of, it's still going to be open to the public. Everyone will have their say. So with that, unless anyone else has any questions or comments, one last try. Okay, we'll call the meeting to a close. Thank you, everyone. And we'll be getting information out on the next meetings in the next week or so.